Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to live in a world without clocks? Where your day begins with birdsong and ends with the setting of the sun? Where time flows not in hours or minutes, but in seasons? We live in a world of instant everything, instant replies, instant meals, even instant success. But before this rush, before the hum of cities and the flicker of screens, there was another rhythm. A quieter one. A rhythm of fields and fires, of church bells and footsteps on a dirt road. The medieval era, often misunderstood, often oversimplified, was not just a time of knights and castles, but of people living ordinary, extraordinary lives. I truly hope this video finds its way to many people. If it does find you, or wherever you are, whenever you're watching, I'd love to know not just where, but what you're doing as you listen. Are you relaxing after a long day? Cleaning your room? Trying to fall asleep with a bit of history in the background? Tell me your quiet moment. If you enjoy stories like this, calm, slow, and human, a like or a subscribe would mean a lot. I'm grateful that you're here. Now, let's begin. Let's take a long, slow walk into the past. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century, is often painted in extremes. Some call it the Dark Ages, imagining it as 1,000 years of ignorance and gloom. Others romanticize it with shining knights, fairy tale castles, and heroic quests. But the truth, like most truths, lies somewhere in between. And that's where we're going. Not to the battlefields or the thrones, but to the quiet corners of the past. To the villages where bread was baked and boots were mended. To the forests that fed and healed. To the candlelit rooms where a monk copied a single book by hand for a lifetime. To the fields where entire families lived their entire lives never traveling more than 10 miles from where they were born. We'll wander through time at the pace it was lived. Slowly. You might ask, why look back at this time at all? The medieval world shaped our modern one in ways we rarely notice. Ideas we take for granted, community, storytelling, timekeeping, education, even basic government, all trace long, winding roots back to these years. And even more than that, the way people lived in the Middle Ages offers a striking contrast to our present lives. In a world of urgency, there's something deeply calming about looking back at a slower time. A time when people rose with the sun, worked with their hands, relied on their neighbors, and measured their years not by productivity apps or Google calendars, but by harvests, holy days, and the turning of leaves. That simplicity, not romanticized, but understood, holds a quiet wisdom. History textbooks and movies often show us the loudest parts of history: kings, wars, crusades, conquests. But what about the people who didn't make it into the chronicles? The woman who woke before dawn to light the fire and prepare bread. The shepherd who knew every tree along his route. The child learning to count by picking stones near the well. The elderly man with 100 stories, none of them written down. These lives were not background characters, they were the medieval world. And this video is for them. For the weavers, the bakers, the mothers, the monks. For the quiet work that built the world, unnoticed, uncelebrated, and yet utterly essential. Imagine, for a moment, a world without electric light. At night, your only choices are the glow of the fire, the flicker of a candle, or the moon overhead. Most of the world sleeps. The village is still. You might hear an owl, or the wind gently bending the trees. This isn't just romantic imagery. This was reality. Daily life in the medieval era was deeply shaped by the natural world, not just in labor, but in rhythm. You worked when there was light. You rested when there wasn't. Time was circular, not linear. Seasons mattered more than hours. Farming, trade, celebration, all followed this rhythm. In a way, life itself was slower, but fuller. The medieval person was intimately connected with their surroundings. Every sound, every scent, every change in the air carried meaning. Spring was not just a time of flowers, but of possibility. Winter, a time of reflection and endurance. You didn't scroll through a feed to check the weather, you felt it. You didn't check your schedule for next week, you looked at the sky, the trees, the animals. In the next few hours, we're not just going to learn history, we're going to gently walk through it. You'll hear about how people organized their time and labor, and what work meant to a medieval villager. The warmth and necessity of community, where survival depended not on independence, but interdependence. The spiritual and practical relationship people had with nature, as both resource and symbol. The pursuit of knowledge, not through universities and degrees, but through repetition, memory, and quiet devotion. The pain and struggle of life, too. Because medieval life was not easy. Disease, war, hunger, and hardship were real. And yet so was resilience. You'll hear about it slowly, with intention. Like a story told beside a fire, or a memory shared before sleep. One of the beautiful things about the medieval era is how it reminds us that history is not just the story of the powerful. It's the story of everyone. And just like a tapestry, every life was a thread, simple on its own, but essential to the pattern. Your thread might never be seen alone. But it mattered. So did theirs. Let's walk together now, into a world before rush hours and email, before algorithms and airports. A world quieter, yes, but no less rich. Let's step into the medieval past. Time, in the medieval world, did not tick forward in a precise mechanical rhythm. It moved slowly, unevenly, as if drawn along by the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, and the gentle, sometimes unpredictable pulse of the earth itself. There were no alarms, no synchronized clocks, no global schedules. A person's day was shaped more by the angle of sunlight falling across the fields than by any fixed hour on a dial. To live in the medieval countryside was to exist in a rhythm that we today can barely imagine, one guided by nature, necessity, and custom more than calculation. Most people in medieval Europe lived in small rural communities, villages tucked between forests, rolling hills, and winding rivers. Their lives were tethered to the soil beneath their feet, and to the tools they held in their calloused hands. The vast majority were peasants, laboring not just out of obligation, but because survival depended on it. There was food to grow, animals to tend, firewood to gather, clothing to mend, and homes to maintain. Yet for all the work that filled the days, there was also a certain slowness, a kind of spaciousness that emerged from the lack of speed that defines our modern age. A peasant's year unfolded not in weeks or months, but in seasons. Spring was for sowing, the careful planting of barley, rye, oats, and wheat into furrowed fields that had been plowed and harrowed with hand tools or with the help of oxen. Summer brought the long days of weeding, maintaining crops, and preparing for the eventual harvest. Autumn was a flurry of reaping, threshing, and storing what the earth had offered. Winter was quieter, colder, and more introspective, time for repairing tools, preserving food, and gathering with others when the days grew short and the nights long. Each task, though physically demanding, was accompanied by a pace that followed natural cycles. There was no rushing through harvest because the grain would not wait, but there was also no over-engineered efficiency squeezing every second of labor. People worked from sunrise to sunset, taking brief moments to eat simple meals or share a word with a neighbor. They listened to the sounds of animals, the creak of cart wheels, the sighing of wind through trees. And in that rhythm, they found a kind of equilibrium, one we've perhaps lost. Children grew up within this flow. From an early age, they learned by doing, by watching, by joining their elders in daily routines. A young girl might help her mother spin wool, gather herbs, or bake bread in the communal oven. A boy might carry water, learn to trap rabbits, or follow his father into the fields with cautious steps. These weren't tasks assigned in the name of productivity, but natural extensions of being part of a working household. There was pride in contributing, and wisdom passed down not in classrooms but in repetition, correction, and shared silence. The days, though filled with labor, were not necessarily devoid of pleasure. Medieval life, especially in the countryside, allowed for moments of song, story, and communion. After a long day's work, a family might gather around the hearth, its flames crackling beneath a blackened pot of stew. Stories were told, some ancient, passed down from ancestors, others newly spun from the events of the day. A traveling minstrel might wander into a village and bring with him songs from distant towns, tales of kings and saints, or just news from a place beyond the next hill. Feast days punctuated the otherwise steady rhythm of the seasons. These were more than religious observances, they were crucial breaks from the routine. People dressed in their finest, which might mean a cleaner tunic or a carefully mended cloak. They danced, they sang, they drank ale brewed in local households. Even the most modest of villages found ways to mark these days with joy. Joy that was communal, earthy, and born of a rare and welcome pause. Time itself was understood differently. The day began not at midnight, but at dawn. The hours were divided not by clocks but by the changing quality of light. The church bell, where it existed, might toll for prayer at matins, terce, sext, and vespers, dividing the day into liturgical moments rather than industrial slots. In many villages, sundials, or even the shadows cast by familiar trees served as timekeepers. The pace was intuitive. People knew when to rise, when to rest, and when the soil whispered that it was time to plant. The tools of work were few and simple: wooden plows, sickles, hoes, baskets. They were used not for speed, but for reliability. Hands hardened by labor became the most trusted instruments. Feet, too, knew their terrain, paths worn between cottages, fields, and forests. Boots were patched again, and every object, from a tin cup to a pitchfork, was repaired rather than discarded. Meals were slow affairs, not in their preparation but in their simplicity. Pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and sometimes bits of meat, was a daily staple. Bread, dark and coarse, came from locally milled flour. Cheese, eggs, and the occasional salted fish or preserved fruit filled in the gaps. Flavors came from herbs grown just outside the door. There was no abundance, but there was familiarity in every bite. The food connected people not only to the land but to each other. What was eaten today had likely been planted months before by one's own hand or by that of a neighbor. Leisure existed, but it did not look like our modern escapes. There were no vacations, no digital distractions. Instead, leisure might mean sitting in a patch of sun after the animals were fed, or pausing to share a joke with a friend on the way to market. It meant walking slowly, noticing the patterns of birdsong, or the way mist curled over fields in the morning. Time, when not driven by haste, became more than something to manage, it became something to witness. And for all its hardships, this slow life had depth. It offered time to think, to feel, to connect with others and the world in an unhurried way. People understood patience not as a virtue, but as a necessity. You waited for crops to grow. You waited for rain. You waited for healing. There were no instant answers, and that slowness shaped the inner lives of those who lived it. In the long evenings, when work was done and darkness settled in, the village grew quiet. Light came from the fire, from tallow candles, from the moon if it was full. Voices softened, stories lengthened, and sometimes there was only silence, the kind of silence that is deep, not empty. It carried the weight of the day, the nearness of others, the eternal rhythm of the world turning slowly toward another morning. When winter arrived, everything softened into a different rhythm. The fields, once bustling with labor, lay quiet under frost or snow. Tools were hung up. The tempo of life shifted, not toward leisure, but toward inwardness. This was the season of maintenance, of mending what was worn down by the year's efforts. Men fixed cartwheels and sharpened blades dulled by harvest. Women spun wool by the firelight, patching clothing threadbare from months of work. Children were tucked indoors more often, listening, learning, and absorbing the hum of domestic life. Winter was not idle, but it was slower. Animals still needed feeding. Water still needed hauling. But the urgency of planting and harvesting faded, replaced by a patient endurance of cold days and long nights. In many ways, winter was the most honest season. It revealed who had prepared well, who had enough, and who would struggle until spring. Yet even in hardship, there was a certain calm. Life slowed because it had to, not because people chose to retreat. There was no defying the season. You followed it. In some homes, reading or reciting scripture might take place during these dark months, if a family was fortunate enough to own a book, or more likely, to know someone who could read aloud from one. The voice of a literate relative or a visiting monk was a thread of warmth. Their stories gave shape to the days, added structure to the stillness, offered reminders that this world, cold as it might be, was part of a larger story. But most homes relied on oral tradition. Stories passed down across generations, fables, tales of saints, parables twisted with folklore, sustained imagination and identity. Even as outside the wind howled through gaps in wooden walls, these stories became insulation of another kind. The communal aspect of rural life extended into these quiet months as well. Villagers might gather to help a neighbor slaughter a pig or repair a roof, not just out of kindness but out of necessity. One person alone could not meet all the demands of life in a harsh landscape. Winter forged bonds even tighter. Those who shared food, warmth, and skill with others increased not just the survival of the group, but the strength of their own place within it. You gave because you would someday need. You helped because you had been helped. And in this exchange, the slow life showed its depth, not isolation, but interdependence. There was a kind of elegance to this simplicity. Time was not wasted because it was not owned. It flowed, and people moved with it. Unlike our world, with its fragmentation and speed, theirs was one of integration. Work, rest, conversation, ritual, each was part of the same fabric. There was no work-life balance because the two were never separated. A man could hoe a row of soil while speaking softly to the child beside him. A woman could stir the pot and chant to him. Productivity wasn't a goal, and efficiency wasn't a virtue. The point was to live, and to live well enough to keep going. It's easy to romanticize this world, but slow living didn't mean easy living. Tasks were physical, relentless. Water didn't come from a tap, it was carried from a stream or well. Heat meant splitting wood, stacking it, feeding it to a hungry hearth. Illness had no urgent care clinic. A cough could become something else entirely. Injuries lingered. Toothaches were endured, not treated. Childbirth was a trial watched with prayer and held breath. Yet the endurance this required also bred a certain strength, not just of body, but of character. People learned to suffer without spectacle. They grieved, they healed, they worked through fatigue not because it was noble, but because it was ordinary. In a world where nothing came easily, small joys carried immense weight. A loaf of bread that rose just right. The first green bud in spring. A day without pain. These things were not overlooked. They were held quietly, as treasures. Even love, in such a world, moved slowly. Courtship took place in glances at market, in shared tasks at planting time, in the steady turning of familiarity into trust. Marriages were not always about romance, yet they grew into companionship forged through effort. Two people raising children, mending clothes, sharing food from the same field, watching seasons turn from one roof. Love was found in the daily doing, not proclaimed with words, but proven with labor. Festivals still brought color into this muted world. May Day, with its bright ribbons and laughter, marked the turn toward light. Harvest festivals honored the bounty of labor and the grace of survival. These days were moments when time stretched differently, when people danced, drank, told bawdy stories, and forgot for a while the steady hand of toil that guided the rest of the year. But even celebration followed the natural cycle. It came after the planting, after the reaping, after the storing. Joy was seasonal, like everything else. And while modern time is dominated by the clock, medieval time was measured by tasks. You didn't say, "It's 4 p.m., you said, "It's time to bring in the animals," or "It's near Vespers." Monasteries kept more precise schedules, but for most, timekeeping was an act of memory and observation. You watched the length of shadows. You listened for the bell from the church tower, if your village had one. You learned, from childhood, the language of light. This connection to the natural world shaped everything. People read the sky. They noticed the way birds behaved before a storm. They remembered what last year's frost did to the barley. They respected the limits of what they could control. It wasn't superstition, though that existed too. It was attention, careful, generational attention to the cues of a world that spoke in signs and patterns rather than commands. A clouded morning in spring meant something. A dry autumn wind warned of fire risk. The smell of soil after the first thaw was a sign that soon, the earth would be ready. This wasn't a life lived apart from nature, it was one lived within it, beneath it, under its terms. The slow life wasn't a retreat from civilization. It was civilization of a different kind, woven from cooperation, memory, resilience, and a deep reverence for the seasons. And in this slowness, time didn't disappear. It expanded. A child watching his father carve a new tool learned patience not from instruction, but from hours of observation. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to spin flax taught not just technique, but rhythm, the kind of rhythm that stays with you even when your hands are still. That rhythm passed down generation by generation, an invisible thread running through the ordinary days. As the village turned inward for another winter, there were no grand resolutions. No countdowns or fireworks. The end of the year was marked in the quality of light, the fullness of larders, the ache in joints. People did not chase time, they endured it, walked with it, sometimes quietly waited for it to pass. And when it did, they began again. Not with noise, but with quiet steadiness, the kind only possible when life moves not at the speed of machines, but at the pace of growing things. The tools of time in the medieval world weren't made of gears or glass, but of memory, tradition, and the heavens. People looked upward not just for faith, but for guidance. The stars were not romantic decorations, they were signs. The position of Orion in the night sky might signal the coming of winter. The phases of the moon informed planting and harvest rituals, guided fishing practices, and even suggested the best time for certain kinds of medicine. Even without formal education, the average person in a medieval village often knew far more about the patterns of sky and soil than we do today. Their calendars weren't hanging on a wall, they were lived, walked, felt. When the hedgerows began to bloom in a certain way, it meant lambing season was near. When the last frost cracked the soil underfoot, it meant the time for sowing had arrived. This knowledge wasn't written down, it was embodied. Passed on not by reading, but by doing, season after season. One of the most fascinating things about slow medieval life is how deeply intertwined it was with cyclical time. Not just the seasons, but holy days, market days, even the way people thought about life and death followed a circle, not a line. Modern life often feels like a race forward, always climbing, always accelerating. In contrast, medieval life turned in loops. Each year repeated the same labor, the same celebrations, the same prayers. There was comfort in that. Repetition wasn't boring. It was grounding. The church played a central role in maintaining this cycle. Its bells, audible for miles, acted as communal timekeepers. They called the faithful to prayer, but also marked the passing of hours in places where no clock existed. Even in the most remote hamlet, the rhythm of life could be traced by these sounds: morning prayers, midday mass, evening reflection. The days, no matter how ordinary, were threaded with sacred markers. And this rhythm shaped people's inner lives as well. They didn't compartmentalize time the way we do: work here, worship there, leisure somewhere else. It was all one flow. A man could pause his plowing to cross himself as the church bell rang. A woman might whisper a prayer while kneading dough. Children played under the shadow of both trees and steeples. The divine was not elsewhere. It was folded into the fabric of the everyday. Even those without deep piety moved within this spiritual calendar. It guided them, offered predictability in a world otherwise full of uncertainty. Saints' days gave people breaks from labor, stories to tell, rituals to follow. These weren't just holy obligations, they were psychological anchors. In a world with limited knowledge of science and medicine, people turned to ritual not out of ignorance, but out of a need for order. It was a way to make sense of what they couldn't control. Consider something as seemingly mundane as rest. Today, rest is often framed as laziness unless it's been earned, tracked, or scheduled. But in the medieval world, rest was woven into life. There were Sundays, feast days, holy days of obligation. There were long winters when the land demanded people slow down. The body followed the world. It wasn't coerced into performance. And while there were certainly those who toiled endlessly, especially the poor and landless, there was still a deeper cultural understanding that life must ebb and flow. That exhaustion was not the pinnacle of virtue. Perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of medieval life is the dignity found in repetition. To churn butter every day, to carry water, to rake hay, these were not seen as meaningless acts. They were life itself. People didn't need to find their passion or career calling in the modern sense. Their sense of worth came from contribution, from being part of a whole. A blacksmith knew his work was needed. A shepherd knew he fed the village. A midwife knew she held generations in her hands. Meaning didn't need to be invented, it was inherited. This sense of contribution extended to all ages. Elders weren't sidelined, they were respected for their knowledge, their steadiness. Even if their hands couldn't grip a tool, their memory could guide others through storms, literal or metaphorical. Children weren't seen as burdens to be entertained until adulthood, but as apprentices to life. They listened. They helped. They learned by being in the room. Everyone, regardless of age, had a place in the story being lived together. It's easy, in our world of noise and urgency, to think of slowness as stagnation. But the medieval rhythm of life tells another story. Slowness was clarity. It allowed things to be seen, not just done. You could watch the grain grow. You could listen to the silence after snowfall. You could feel the passage of time in your bones, not just on your watch. And in that seeing, people developed a kind of closeness to each other, to their work, to the land, that we now chase with retreats and mindfulness apps. There's something else, too, something less talked about but no less important. Boredom. It existed, of course. Long stretches of stillness in winter. Repetitive tasks in summer. But boredom wasn't something to be eliminated. It was endured. And in enduring it, people cultivated a different kind of imagination. One that didn't come from screens, but from staring into a fire, or out across a frozen field, and letting the mind wander. Many of the world's enduring stories, fairy tales, folk legends, songs that still echo through time, were born in these quiet spaces. Passed from mouth to mouth around the hearth. Embroidered into fabric. Scratched into wood. Boredom, in a way, was the soil in which creativity grew. It was not seen as a flaw in the day, but as a door. And through all this, through the turning of seasons, the ringing of bells, the sowing and reaping, the cold and the heat, people knew their place. Not in the rigid social hierarchy alone, but in the cosmos. They were part of something larger, something ordered. They didn't invent their own meaning anew every morning. They inherited it, shaped it, passed it on. Life was not always just or kind, but it was held in a shared frame. A frame that gave weight to choices, and dignity to the quiet labor of hands. That is perhaps the most instructive thing we can take from their world. Not that it was better, it was not easier, not safer, not freer, but that it was coherent. There was a wholeness to life that is hard to recreate when everything is fast, segmented, and driven by abstraction. The simple life was not about poverty of ambition. It was about clarity of purpose. Today, we often chase simplicity through subtraction, trying to remove noise, stress, speed. But medieval simplicity came through integration. Life was not simple because it lacked complexity. It was simple because its parts belonged to a whole. The work, the rest, the worship, the learning, all threads in the same cloth. And so we are left with their footprints, not in books or monuments alone, but in the idea that to live slowly is not to live small. It is to live attentively. To live within the world, not above it. To live with rhythm, not resistance. They walked slower, but they noticed more. And in doing so, they lived lives whose lessons echo still, not in headlines, but in the quiet spaces between them. In medieval towns, though smaller and busier than rural villages, life still pulsed with a kind of slowness unfamiliar to us now. Markets were noisy, full of clamor and scent, spices from distant ports, salted fish, wax candles, bolts of rough wool, but even this activity moved on foot, at a walking pace. You carried what you could. You waited your turn. No deliveries came overnight. No message arrived without days of travel. And so, patience was not a virtue, it was the default setting of daily life. Apprentices learn trades not through a weekend course or a video tutorial, but over years. A boy apprenticing to a cooper or a weaver might start as young as 10 and not reach full mastery until his 20s. Each technique was taught through demonstration, correction, repetition. There were no written manuals for most, just the slow accumulation of skill through shared labor. Knowledge was not transmitted quickly, but deeply. It settled into the body, becoming muscle memory, quiet instinct. To become good at something took time. No shortcuts were expected. None were possible. And in many ways, that was the point. Learning something slowly meant you understood not just the how, but the why. A potter knew the feel of different clay before shaping it. A midwife recognized the rhythm of a healthy birth not from diagrams, but from hours spent kneeling beside mothers in candlelit rooms. Wisdom grew not in sudden insight, but in the accumulation of ordinary days. Even when the medieval world moved quickly, during harvest, during war, during famine, it returned always to its natural rhythm. Like the breath after exertion. Like the hush that follows a storm. That rhythm, deeply embedded in every aspect of life, provided continuity even in times of fear or change. People trusted the return of the sun. They trusted the thaw of spring. And that trust, however humble, gave them the strength to keep going. There's something revealing in how medieval people viewed their own lives. Few expected glory. Fewer still dreamed of rising above their station. Social mobility, for the vast majority, was not part of the imagination. Instead, they sought steadiness. They hoped for enough. Enough food to last the winter. Enough health to see their children grow. Enough peace to sow and reap without soldiers burning the fields. Life was measured not in accomplishments, but in endurance. In survival. And within that frame, even small joys became radiant. A good harvest meant celebration. A birth that went well was a miracle. A night with music and warmth and full bellies became a memory retold for years. Joy didn't come in abundance. It came in flashes, quick, sharp, unforgettable. And because it was rare, it was cherished. Not posted, not broadcast, not quantified, just felt. And what did people think about in these quiet lives? What hopes, what fears, what stories? We know fragments, from letters, wills, marginalia scribbled in manuscripts. We know that people prayed, of course, but also that they joked, argued, gossiped, worried. A peasant woman feared the illness of her child no less than a queen. A young man wished for love or luck no less than any prince. Human emotion, across class and time, remains astonishingly familiar. The difference was in how those emotions were carried. Without therapy or distraction or constant stimulation, emotions had to be lived through. Grief wasn't managed. It simply sat with you at the hearth, heavy and unmoving. Joy had no playlist. It came when it came and left just as quietly. People felt their lives deeply, not because they were dramatic, but because there was space for the feeling. Silence allowed it. Slowness allowed it. And so, too, did the communal fabric. No one lived alone, not really. You were part of a village, a guild, a household. Even the poorest beggar was recognized by name, known by his neighbors. You belonged somewhere. That belonging came with obligations, yes, but also with identity. You were not just you. You were your role. Your kin. Your craft. Your prayers. That collective identity gave life meaning beyond the self. It also meant that your life's work was rarely just for you. A field was plowed for the family. Bread was baked for a household. A chair was built not to display, but to sit on, by someone who needed it. There was little waste, little surplus. Everything had a use. Time, too. Time was spent, not filled. And while this could become monotonous, even punishing, it also brought coherence. You could see the value of your labor. You could feel its place in the larger picture. Even the way people died reflected this. Death came often and without much warning, through fever, childbirth, injury, hunger. Yet it was not hidden away. The dying were surrounded by family. The dead were buried in ground the living passed daily. Memory was kept not by photos or pages, but by proximity. She died in this room. He worked this field. The past wasn't a foreign land. It lived in the same space. To study the slow life of the medieval world is not to envy it. It was full of hardship, injustice, and fragility. But it offers something we have almost forgotten, a way of being that was rooted, not restless. A life that was not defined by constant motion, but by attention to seasons, to labor, to one another. It reminds us that there was once a time when human beings lived with time, not against it. And that this slowness did not diminish life, it deepened it. In their long walks across muddy roads, their quiet meals of barley and onions, their songs sung while mending nets, medieval people left behind more than artifacts. They left behind an invitation. A whisper across the centuries. To listen. To slow down. To notice. To be fully present in the life you're already living. To live in the medieval world was, above all, to live among others. Isolation, in the way we think of it today, was almost unimaginable. From birth to death, your life unfolded in the presence of others, family, neighbors, fellow laborers, your priest, your lord. Privacy was not a right. It was a rarity. And for most, it was neither missed nor mourned. Life was public, shared, communal. A village was not just a place on a map. It was an organism, and you were one of its living parts. Everyone knew everyone else, not by profile picture or passing acquaintance, but by voice, gait, kinship, reputation. They knew the way you laughed, the stories of your childhood, the sound of your hammer, the rhythm of your footsteps in the morning fog. This intimacy could be stifling, but it was also anchoring. You were known. You belonged. And that belonging came with obligations. To live in community was to be needed and to need. If your neighbor's roof caved in, you helped rebuild it. If your cow fell ill, others brought milk. If your child was born, women gathered to aid the birth and watch the older siblings. If you died, the community buried you, prayed for your soul, and remembered your name. No one stood apart, not for long. This interdependence was not charity. It was survival. A single household could not thrive alone, not in a world where floods could wipe out grain stores, where war bands might burn a village overnight, where illness spread quickly through cramped spaces. The village stood together because it had to. And within that necessity, something deeper was forged: trust. Not the abstract trust of contracts and passwords, but lived trust, built over seasons of planting side by side, borrowing tools, sharing meals, raising barns and babies and hopes together. In such a world, strength was not found in self-sufficiency, but in contribution. You mattered because others relied on you. The blacksmith's work enabled the farmer's harvest. The miller turned the grain into flour for the baker. The midwife ensured that the next generation was safely brought into the world. Each person's role was woven tightly into the fabric of the village, and that fabric could not afford to tear. Even feasting, one of the few joyful escapes from daily labor, was a shared act. A wedding might feed the entire village. A good harvest called for communal celebration, with food brought from many homes, music made from many hands. Joy was magnified by its sharing. No one feasted alone. The church, central in both spiritual and practical matters, also served as a communal anchor. It wasn't just where you prayed, it was where you heard news, settled disputes, stored records, and gathered for ritual. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, all passed through its doors. The church bell was a constant voice, reminding the village not just of divine presence but of collective rhythm. Time was communal too. But perhaps the most powerful expression of medieval community lay in the way people faced hardship. When fire struck, when illness came, when famine crept in, people did not endure it as individuals. They drew closer together. Families took in orphans. Neighbors shared the last of their bread. Labor was redistributed to help the weakest. Survival was not a personal achievement. It was a shared effort. And that effort extended beyond physical needs. Emotional support was quieter, but no less real. People didn't speak of mental health in the way we do now, but grief, worry, and weariness were not hidden. They were carried in plain sight, seen and recognized. A woman who lost a child was not left alone to suffer, others came to sit, to tend, to remember. A man whose wife died was offered food, company, distraction. Mourning was collective. Healing was slow and shared. Injustice, too, was addressed communally, though often imperfectly. A crime against one person was a crime against the peace of the village. Gossip, far from trivial, functioned as a kind of informal regulation. Your reputation mattered. It could determine your marriage prospects, your standing at market, your role in community decisions. People watched each other closely, and this scrutiny shaped behavior. It was not always fair, but it was effective. You lived in the mirror of your community's eyes. Even conflict had its place. Disputes were inevitable, over land, livestock, insults. But they were rarely allowed to fester in isolation. Villages had their own ways of resolving tension, from formal manorial courts to informal mediation led by elders or respected neighbors. The goal was not punishment so much as restoration. Harmony mattered more than retribution. Children were raised not just by parents, but by the village itself. Other adults scolded or praised them, taught them crafts, told them stories. A child's moral education came not from isolated instruction, but from immersion in a living, breathing ethical system. They learned by watching how adults shared food, how they honored feast days, how they helped the elderly across a muddy road. Right and wrong were lived out in daily acts. An old age, when it came, was not exile. It was often a position of honor. Elders remembered hard winters, long wars, failed crops, and good years. Their memory was a form of knowledge. Their presence was a kind of continuity. They were not shut away, but brought into the circle, consulted, cherished. To live long was not to be forgotten, it was to become essential in a new way. We often imagine medieval people as hardened by their times, emotionally distant, suspicious of sentiment. But everything in their world pointed to the opposite. In the absence of convenience, in the face of so much danger, people grew emotionally attuned to one another. They had to. They noticed when someone was limping. They heard the change in a neighbor's tone. They made space for joy, and for grief, because these were not distractions from the real work of life, they were the real work. And their stories reflected this. Folk tales and religious parables weren't just entertainment. They were maps for living together. The foolish man who hoarded, the cruel woman who mocked her neighbors, these characters met unhappy ends not just because they were immoral, but because they betrayed the community. The heroes were those who gave freely, who forgave, who persisted not alone but together. These stories didn't just reflect communal values. They taught them, reinforced them, ensured their survival. Even art and architecture echoed this idea. Churches and cathedrals, even the humblest ones, were built by many hands over many years. No one person saw the project from beginning to end. You might spend your life carving stones for a wall that would not be finished until after your death. Yet the work mattered, because it belonged to the village. It was for the generations to come. And in that collective act of creation, people found purpose beyond themselves. Not all communities were idyllic, of course. Tension simmered beneath the surface, old feuds, envy over land or inheritance, resentments handed down as carefully as heirlooms. But even these fractures were managed within the framework of interdependence. You might despise your neighbor, but you still needed him to help raise your barn or lend a sickle during harvest. Personal feelings were often subordinate to collective needs. The survival of the group came first. This social pressure could breed hypocrisy, but it also demanded cooperation. It polished people's rough edges, forced them to practice tolerance, and often drew unexpected friendships from shared work. Bonds were formed not only through affection, but through repetition of tasks, of encounters, of responsibilities. You saw the same people at the well each morning, the same faces at Mass each week. A kind of familiarity emerged, deeper than fondness, an acceptance of each other's flaws as part of the fabric of the place. Customs reinforced this fabric in countless small ways. In many villages, there were seasonal rituals that required everyone's presence. May Day dances, harvest festivals, winter feasts, these were not just celebrations, but reaffirmations of unity. Even small events, a pig slaughter, a betrothal, the building of a new fence, became collective moments. Children watched. Elders advised. Neighbors lent a hand. There was no such thing as an isolated milestone. Marriage was perhaps the clearest example. It was rarely a private affair. The entire village participated, not only in the ceremony but in the preparation, the negotiation, the aftermath. Marriage meant joining two families, but also reaffirming the stability of the village. It wasn't just about love, it was about alliances, land, reputation, and the future. Even the matchmaking process was often communal. Parents consulted neighbors. Unions were assessed not only for personal compatibility, but for how they would shape the balance of life in the village. This idea, that one's personal life was always tethered to the collective, can feel intrusive to modern sensibilities. But it gave life a kind of gravitational pull. You weren't drifting. You were rooted. Your choices mattered to others. And theirs to you. This interconnection didn't eliminate loneliness or struggle, but it surrounded those feelings with context, with witness. And when communities were well-functioning, they offered a kind of resilience that could not be manufactured by wealth or status alone. In times of famine, those with slightly more gave to those with less. In the wake of loss, sorrow was shared. There were no therapists, but there were familiar hands, shared silences, remembered songs. There was, in many places, a gentle dignity in being held by one's people. Among the most striking aspects of this world was the informal economy of mutual aid. People lent not only tools and livestock but time and effort. You helped your neighbor with his harvest not because you were paid, but because he would help you next week. You tended someone's sheep during illness, and they returned the favor with firewood. This barter of time, labor, and goodwill was rarely written down, but it was meticulously remembered. Woven into all this was a sense of reciprocity that extended beyond immediate return. Many acts were performed with no demand for equivalence. You fed a widow's children not because she could repay you, but because you had once been fed in your own time of need. Memory was a ledger more enduring than parchment. This sense of social responsibility was not universal. There were cruel landlords, exploitative merchants, bitter rivalries. But even within these tensions, people found ways to protect each other. Women formed quiet networks of support, sharing herbs, offering child care, warning one another of danger. Craftsmen taught their apprentices not only skills but ethics, when to forgive a debt, how to honor a handshake. These values were not always articulated, but they were modeled. In cities and larger towns, this sense of community evolved into guilds, formal organizations of workers that governed trade, maintained quality, and cared for members in times of hardship. A master mason or weaver did not succeed alone. He was part of a structure that trained, protected, and disciplined. Guilds offered solidarity, but also accountability. If your work was shoddy, your guild stood at risk. If your apprentice misbehaved, it reflected on your standing. Honor was not just personal, it was communal. Within the monastic communities, this interdependence took on an even deeper tone. Monks lived by strict rules of shared labor, shared silence, shared prayer. They worked the land together, copied manuscripts together, mourned the dead together. Their vows bound them not only to God but to one another. And while cloistered life could be rigid, it also provided a profound sense of purpose and connection. Within the walls of the abbey, time moved in harmony with the liturgical year. Meals, chants, readings, all were communal acts, offering a counterpoint to the chaos beyond. Outside the walls, peasants and artisans created their own rhythms, equally rich in meaning. A family might pass down not only a trade, but a specific bench, a specific loom, a way of speaking. Dialects were hyperlocal. Proverbs, nicknames, and stories marked one village from another. Even if you traveled only a few miles, you felt the difference. Place mattered. Language was not just communication, it was identity. Festivals gave these local identities room to flourish. While the major feast days, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, were shared across Christendom, each village had its own saints' days, its own traditions. A certain well might be blessed each spring. A relic might be paraded through the streets in midsummer. These events were not just religious, they were social contracts, moments when the village reaffirmed its coherence through celebration. And the celebrations themselves were joyful precisely because they were shared. Dancing, music, food, these were not passive entertainments, but participatory acts. You danced with your cousins, sang with your neighbors, offered bread from your own hearth. The line between performer and audience blurred. Everyone contributed. Everyone was part of the story being told. Even the architecture of the village reflected this communal spirit. Houses were clustered tightly, often around a central green or near the church. Fences were minimal or absent. Animals roamed freely, watched by many eyes. Water sources, like wells and streams, were shared and maintained by common effort. Paths crossed constantly. You couldn't avoid your neighbors even if you tried. And so, from the layout of the land to the rituals of life, medieval communities were built on the idea that people were better, stronger, wiser, more human, together. This did not erase suffering. But it shaped how suffering was met. Not with solitude, but with solidarity. As powerful as these bonds were, they were not infallible. Communities were not immune to fear, suspicion, or violence. When famine struck or plague swept through a town, the fabric of trust could fray. People looked for explanations, sometimes in the stars, sometimes in sin, and too often, in each other. Scapegoats were found. Accusations were whispered, then shouted. A woman who had always walked alone might be called a witch. A traveler might be blamed for bad luck. Fear turned inward. And yet, even in these moments of fracture, the idea of the community remained central. A threat to one was a threat to all. Village leaders, priests, reeves, elders, would call for unity, penance, fasting, or prayer. Collective guilt was met with collective ritual. People processed through the streets, barefoot, chanting for mercy. The logic of suffering was not individual, but shared. If rain did not come, perhaps the whole village had sinned. If war was near, perhaps God was testing them together. Religion, in this context, was more than belief. It was a social technology, a unifying force. It explained what could not be explained, but also created space for communal response. Saints were invoked not only for healing, but for protection of fields, of animals, of entire towns. Their feast days brought people together not only in worship but in celebration. A church was not simply a place to pray, it was the emotional and spiritual heart of the community. Its bells did not just mark the time, they called people to remember who they were, and whom they belonged to. This spiritual sense of belonging extended even to the dead. Ancestors were remembered in prayers and church records, in stories passed down beside hearths. People visited graves, lit candles, made offerings. The past was not gone, it was alive in memory, ritual, and land. You lived where your grandparents had lived. You tilled the same fields. You passed the same tree they once passed. Their footsteps echoed in yours. You were never alone in time. This continuity created a sense of identity that was both personal and collective. You were part of a lineage, not just of blood, but of place. A peasant who had never traveled beyond the valley still knew who he was because he knew where he came from. And the village, in turn, knew him. It had watched him grow, fall, learn, laugh. He belonged. For those displaced by war, exile, economic ruin, this loss of community was a deeper wound than the loss of possessions. To be without a village was to be vulnerable in every way. You had no one to vouch for you, no one to lend a hand, no one to recognize your face. It is no coincidence that beggars and wanderers were both feared and pitied. They existed outside the network. They floated. They had no center. But for those within, the center held. And it did more than support survival. It offered identity, memory, and dignity. Even the poorest laborer knew that he was part of something larger. His grain fed the village. His song lifted the festival. His presence, however humble, mattered. Stories reinforced this truth. Medieval folk tales are filled with unlikely heroes, ploughmen who defeat giants, washerwomen who outwit lords. These stories did not flatter the powerful. They honored the communal. They taught that wisdom could live in a grandmother's kitchen, that courage could arise from the field, that salvation could come not from kings but from neighbors. Even the Christian story itself, the story of Christ, was told not only as a divine mystery, but as a tale of shared suffering, shared redemption, shared hope. These values extended to how people thought about justice and fairness. The idea of the commons, shared land for grazing, gathering firewood, or collecting herbs, was fundamental to village life. It was not a gift from the Lord, it was a birthright of the people. To protect the commons was to protect the community. And when landlords tried to fence it off or claim it, people resisted, not as individuals, but together. Protests, petitions, even revolts, arose from this shared sense of ownership. The land was theirs not by law, but by memory and use. This wasn't a utopia. Power still corrupted. Class division still hurt. Lords still taxed. But even within these hierarchies, people found ways to insist on their collective dignity. They formed brotherhoods and sisterhoods, mutual aid societies, even informal courts where disputes could be settled outside the shadow of nobility. Their lives were hard, but not voiceless. And the more we look closely, the more we see how resilient and inventive these communities were. They used what they had: clay, wool, stories, silence, song, and turned it into a life. A meaningful one. Not always happy, not always fair, but filled with connection, with presence, with witness. What remains of these communities now? A foundation stone in a ruined chapel. A name carved into a parish record. A well still used in the same place it stood 600 years ago. But more than these, what remains is the idea that human beings are not meant to stand alone. That we are built for each other. That the shared fire is warmer, the shared field more fruitful, the shared grief more bearable. And if we strain to hear, beneath the noise of our own restless world, we might still catch the echo of that truth, carried on the wind that moves through empty fields and moss-covered roads. Not a shout, not a sermon, but a whisper, gentle and enduring: we survived because we stayed together. But the power of community extended beyond the immediate too. Medieval people understood themselves as part of a larger human web, of family lines stretching back to ancestors they never knew, and of future generations who would follow the same paths, walk the same fields, tend the same flocks. The village was a node in this vast, unseen network of time and place. To nurture it was to nurture life itself. In this way, every act of sharing, whether lending a tool, offering food, or simply listening, became a thread in a tapestry too large for any one person to see whole. And yet, each thread mattered. The community was made from countless small acts of care and courage. A mother's steady hands, a neighbor's watchful eyes, a friend's quiet presence in the night. When modern life feels hurried and fragmented, the medieval village offers a different vision, one where time was measured not only by hours and minutes, but by the cycles of the earth and the rhythms of togetherness. It was a life where no one was truly self-made, because all were made by each other. Where identity was inseparable from belonging. Where survival depended on trust, and trust grew from shared experience. Perhaps this is why their stories still speak to us, 6 centuries later. They remind us that community is not a luxury, but a necessity. That connection is not weakness, but strength. That we are never truly alone, so long as we keep the circle unbroken. And in a quiet moment, when the sun dips low and shadows lengthen over fields and villages alike, we might feel the pulse of that old world beneath our feet. The slow, steady heartbeat of a people who lived and died together, and through that living together, found something lasting and true. In the medieval world, nature was not a distant backdrop or a mere resource to be exploited at will. It was an ever-present companion, an active participant in daily life, a source of comfort, mystery, and healing. The cycles of the seasons shaped everything, the rhythm of work and rest, the rise and fall of fortunes, even the hopes and fears that swirled through the minds of the people. To live in harmony with the land was not just practical, but sacred. From the earliest dawn, the sun's light filtered softly through the trees and across the fields, marking time not by clocks but by the steady turning of the earth. The medieval person awoke to birdsong and roosters' calls, moving naturally in step with the day's unfolding. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and growing things, alive with the sounds of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. Nature was not silent, it spoke constantly, through wind, rain, rustling leaves, and the passage of clouds. In the villages, nature was woven into the very fabric of homes and hearths. People built with timber from nearby forests, thatched their roofs with straw harvested from their own fields, and lined their walls with clay and stone quarried close by. The land was not foreign, it was kin. The same soil that fed their crops also held the bones of their ancestors. Streams provided water for cooking and washing, but also carried stories and superstitions, whispered from one generation to the next. This intimate connection gave rise to a deep respect, even reverence, for the natural world. Trees were not just wood, they were markers of place, sacred groves, boundary stones. Certain plants were prized not only for their taste but for their healing powers. Herbs grown in small gardens or gathered from wild meadows held the promise of relief from pain, sickness, or sorrow. The blackthorn bush, the elder tree, the yarrow, all carried meanings beyond the physical, tied to folk wisdom and spiritual protection. Healing was a blend of the practical and the mystical. When fever struck, it was common to reach for herbal remedies: willow bark for pain, chamomile for calm, mint for digestion, plants known from oral tradition and trial. But healing also involved prayer, ritual, and a sense that nature itself could be a mediator between human suffering and divine mercy. A poultice applied with care was as much a gesture of faith as of medicine. The line between science and spirituality was porous, fluid. Farmers looked to the land not only for crops, but for signs. The flight of birds, the color of the sky at dawn, the behavior of animals, each was interpreted as an omen or a guide. Was the spring going to be long or short? Would the harvest be rich or lean? These were not mere superstitions but survival strategies, born of careful observation and centuries of experience. The earth spoke, if one was willing to listen. And listen they did. The medieval calendar was shaped around the natural year. Saints' days often coincided with important agricultural moments: planting, pruning, harvesting. To ignore these rhythms was to invite disaster, not just materially but spiritually. The land was alive, its health intertwined with that of the people. When the soil was tired or the rains failed, all suffered. Even in the harshest times, nature offered solace. When the fields lay barren or sickness hovered close, the woods provided refuge. They were places of quiet mystery, where one could escape the demands of the village and find a moment of peace. Monks retreated to forested hermitages to pray, shepherds sought shade beneath old oaks, children played by clear streams. The wildness was not always feared, sometimes it was embraced. This relationship with nature shaped not only practical life but the medieval imagination. Songs, poems, and stories abounded with natural imagery. Wolves prowled dark forests, rivers carried secrets, mountains stood as eternal witnesses. The landscape was a stage on which human drama unfolded, but also a character itself. It inspired awe, fear, and hope in equal measure. Even today, when we look at those same hills and valleys, we can sense the echoes of this deep bond. The medieval world reminds us that nature is not a resource to be conquered, but a partner in the human story, a source of healing, stability, and enduring wisdom. This bond with nature was not only spiritual but intensely practical. The rhythm of the seasons dictated the very structure of medieval life. In spring, the fields awakened from their winter sleep. Farmers prepared the soil with hand tools, sowing seeds of wheat, barley, and rye, crops that would sustain their families through long months to come. The air filled with the scent of fresh earth turned and the buzz of insects returning. Each day was measured not by hours but by the arc of sunlight, from the first glow of dawn to the fading orange of sunset. Summer was a season of relentless work and hopeful anticipation. The fields needed constant attention, weeding, watering when possible, protecting against pests and animals. But it was also a time for gathering wild herbs and berries, for fishing in streams, for collecting honey from beehives hidden in hollow trees. The natural world was generous, if treated with respect. People understood that the earth gave, but only in balance. Overharvest could lead to famine, carelessness could ruin the delicate web of life. Autumn brought the climax of the year's labor, harvest. Villages came alive with activity as people gathered to reap the fruits of their toil. It was back-breaking work, often done by entire families, from the oldest to the youngest. Scythes sliced through golden stalks, hands plucked and bound sheaves, carts rumbled with heavy loads. This was the moment that decided survival. Grain was stored carefully, barns secured against vermin and weather. The land's bounty was celebrated with feasts and festivals, moments when the community paused to give thanks. Winter, harsh and quiet, was a time for rest and reflection. The fields lay bare under frost and snow, the forest still except for the occasional rustle of a deer or the call of an owl. People retreated indoors to warm fires and the company of family. It was also a time for storytelling, passing down legends of nature spirits, wise women, and heroes who had once walked the very same hills. The starkness of the season deepened their awareness of nature's cycles of death and renewal. Within these cycles, medieval people found more than survival, they found meaning. The earth was not merely ground beneath their feet, it was a living entity that demanded care and respect. Soil was blessed, seeds were sown with prayers, crops were dedicated to saints. Harvest rituals were not only practical but sacred, acts of communion between human and divine, between the seen and the unseen. Even the simplest homes reflected this closeness. Many households maintained small kitchen gardens, growing herbs like sage, thyme, and fennel, not just for flavor, but for healing and protection. Mothers taught children which plants could soothe fevers or ease stomach pains. Apothecaries gathered knowledge from far and wide but always returned to the wisdom of the local land. Forests played a unique role in this relationship. While they could be frightening, dark, dense, home to wolves and bandits, they were also places of refuge and resource. Wood was essential for building, cooking, and heating. People gathered nuts, mushrooms, and berries, learning which were safe and which deadly. Monks harvested medicinal plants, while peasants depended on the forest's gifts for food and fuel. The boundary between cultivated land and wildwoods was a thin one, and both were part of a shared ecosystem. This ecosystem was fragile. Medieval farming, while less intensive than modern industrial agriculture, still altered landscapes. Forests were cleared, rivers diverted, soils plowed repeatedly. Yet, the careful balance between use and renewal was maintained through traditional knowledge, fallow periods where fields were left to rest, communal grazing rules, preservation of woodland groves. These practices ensured the land could continue to sustain life. In the end, nature was both a mirror and a mentor. It reflected human joys and struggles, and taught lessons in patience, resilience, and humility. It was a source of healing, not only of the body but of the spirit, offering stability in an uncertain world. The deep interdependence between people and nature extended into the realm of health and healing. Long before hospitals and modern medicine, medieval communities turned to the land for remedies, combining observation, tradition, and faith. The natural world provided a pharmacy rich with herbs, roots, flowers, and resins, each believed to carry unique powers. Healing was an art learned by generations, often passed down orally within families or monastic communities. Herbalists and wise women were the keepers of this knowledge. They understood how to gather plants at the right time, when their healing qualities were at their peak, and how to prepare poultices, tinctures, and infusions. Willow bark, for example, contained salicin, a natural painkiller long before aspirin was invented. Lavender soothed wounds and anxiety, while rosemary was thought to sharpen memory. These were not random beliefs, but practical knowledge grounded in centuries of careful experimentation. But the act of healing went beyond physical cures. Nature was a sanctuary for the sick and weary, a place to find peace and renewal. Monasteries were often built in remote, green places for this reason, offering quiet gardens and fresh air alongside prayer and care. Pilgrimages led people to holy wells and springs believed to hold miraculous powers. Water, earth, and plant life were intertwined with spiritual healing, creating a holistic approach that embraced body, mind, and soul. The natural world also shaped medieval spirituality in profound ways. Trees, rivers, stones, and animals often featured in religious symbolism and ritual. The oak tree, strong and enduring, was a symbol of strength and protection. The lamb was associated with innocence and sacrifice. Even the changing of the seasons was celebrated as a reflection of divine order. Festivals marking the solstices and equinoxes, often merged with Christian holy days, honored this sacred rhythm. People believed that the balance of nature was a reflection of cosmic order, and when that balance was disturbed by poor weather, failed crops, or disease, it signaled deeper spiritual unrest. This belief encouraged a form of stewardship. People saw themselves as caretakers of the land, responsible not only for their own survival but for the health of the world around them. Overuse or abuse of natural resources was not just practical folly, it was a moral failing. This sense of responsibility fostered customs and laws aimed at protecting the environment. The commons, shared lands where villagers could graze animals or gather wood, were carefully managed to prevent depletion. Community members enforced rules that limited when and how resources could be used, understanding that cooperation was essential for long-term survival. In many ways, these early forms of environmental awareness laid the groundwork for sustainable living. The deep interdependence between people and nature extended into the realm of health and healing. Long before hospitals and modern medicine, medieval communities turned to the land for remedies, combining observation, tradition, and faith. The natural world provided a pharmacy rich with herbs, roots, flowers, and resins, each believed to carry unique powers. Healing was an art learned by generations, often passed down orally within families or monastic communities. Herbalists and wise women were the keepers of this knowledge. They understood how to gather plants at the right time, when their healing qualities were at their peak, and how to prepare poultices, tinctures, and infusions. Willow bark, for example, contained salicin, a natural painkiller long before aspirin was invented. Lavender soothed wounds and anxiety, while rosemary was thought to sharpen memory. These were not random beliefs, but practical knowledge grounded in centuries of careful experimentation. But the act of healing went beyond physical cures. Nature was a sanctuary for the sick and weary, a place to find peace and renewal. Monasteries were often built in remote, green places for this reason, offering quiet gardens and fresh air alongside prayer and care. Pilgrimages led people to holy wells and springs believed to hold miraculous powers. Water, earth, and plant life were intertwined with spiritual healing, creating a holistic approach that embraced body, mind, and soul. The natural world also shaped medieval spirituality in profound ways. Trees, rivers, stones, and animals often featured in religious symbolism and ritual. The oak tree, strong and enduring, was a symbol of strength and protection. The lamb was associated with innocence and sacrifice. Even the changing of the seasons was celebrated as a reflection of divine order. Festivals marking the solstices and equinoxes, often merged with Christian holy days, honored this sacred rhythm. People believed that the balance of nature was a reflection of cosmic order, and when that balance was disturbed by poor weather, failed crops, or disease, it signaled deeper spiritual unrest. This belief encouraged a form of stewardship. People saw themselves as caretakers of the land, responsible not only for their own survival but for the health of the world around them. Overuse or abuse of natural resources was not just practical folly, it was a moral failing. This sense of responsibility fostered customs and laws aimed at protecting the environment. The commons, shared lands where villagers could graze animals or gather wood, were carefully managed to prevent depletion. Community members enforced rules that limited when and how resources could be used, understanding that cooperation was essential for long-term survival. In many ways, these early forms of environmental awareness laid the groundwork for sustainable living. The power of nature as a source of stability extended to its role in daily routines and social structures. Work followed daylight, seasons, and weather patterns. People knew to rise with the sun, pause at midday rest, and end work before dusk. This natural rhythm was not only healthier but fostered a deep connection to the Earth's cycles. Celebrations and communal gatherings were timed with planting and harvesting, creating a shared calendar rooted in nature's own clock. In times of crisis, when plagues or famine struck, nature could seem cruel and indifferent. Yet even then, the natural world offered lessons in resilience. Forests regrew after fire, fields rested and renewed fertility, animals adapted and survived. These cycles of loss and regeneration mirrored human experience, offering hope and a sense of continuity. In this way, medieval people lived not against nature, but within it, its rhythms, its dangers, its gifts shaping every aspect of their existence. They listened to the wind and the birds, read the skies and the soil, and in doing so, found a wisdom both practical and profound. A wisdom that reminds us today of the enduring bond between humanity and the natural world, a bond that sustains life, nourishes the spirit, and anchors us in something larger than ourselves. The relationship with nature also shaped the most intimate parts of life, the home, the family, the cycles of birth, growth, and death. Newborns were often named after flowers, seasons, or natural phenomena, carrying with them a symbolic connection to the world around them. The earth was seen as a mother in its own right, giving life and nurturing it, and this idea echoed through songs, lullabies, and prayers. As children grew, their play often reflected the natural world, running through fields, climbing trees, and imitating animals. This early immersion in nature was not just recreation, it was education. Through interaction with the environment, children learned patience, observation, and respect. They witnessed firsthand how life depended on balance and care. The elderly, too, found comfort in nature. Many spent their last days surrounded by familiar landscapes, their memories entwined with the land that had sustained them. Fields they had tilled, rivers they had fished, woods where they had gathered herbs, all became part of a sacred geography that shaped their identity and eased their passage toward the end of life. Death itself was not a rupture from nature but a return to it. Burial customs reflected this understanding. Bodies were often interred in consecrated ground near the village church, but always within the landscape that had nurtured the person in life. Graves might be marked by trees or flowers, symbols of renewal and hope. The cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth was deeply embedded in the medieval worldview, mirrored in the changing seasons and the growth of crops. Beyond individual lives, nature also served as a symbol of stability amidst the uncertainties of medieval existence. War, famine, disease, they all brought upheaval. But the turning of the seasons, the blooming of spring, the steady fall of rain, these were constants that anchored the soul. No matter how turbulent human affairs became, the earth persisted. This persistence gave medieval people a profound sense of belonging and hope. They saw themselves as part of an unbroken chain of life, linked to the past and the future through the land they worked and loved. This connection was a source of strength, a wellspring of resilience. And as the centuries passed, this legacy remained. The fields and forests of medieval Europe still whisper their stories. The plants and animals that sustained generations continue their ancient rhythms. The lessons learned from living in harmony with nature endure, waiting patiently to be remembered. In the quiet moments, when we slow down and listen, we might catch a glimpse of this timeless bond, a reminder that healing, stability, and belonging come not from mastery over nature, but from respect, care, and shared life. In the popular imagination, the medieval era often appears as a dark age of ignorance, a time when knowledge was scarce, learning was confined to a few, and books were rare treasures locked away in monasteries. Yet, beneath this surface lies a richer, more nuanced story. The medieval world was, in many ways, a vibrant landscape of education and knowledge, shaped by a different set of values and methods than our modern one, but no less remarkable for it. The transmission of knowledge in medieval society was slow and deliberate, intertwined with community, faith, and craft. Learning was not a race to accumulate facts or an individual pursuit of fame, it was a collective journey that linked generations, preserved traditions, and adapted wisdom to daily needs. Knowledge was alive, passed on through word, deed, and memory as much as through books. Monasteries were central to this story, serving as repositories and centers of learning at a time when literacy was rare. Monks spent long hours copying manuscripts by hand, preserving classical texts and religious writings that might otherwise have vanished. Each letter they wrote was a labor of devotion, an act of preservation against the erosion of time. These manuscripts, illuminated with intricate decorations and vibrant colors, were treasures of art and knowledge alike. But education was not confined to cloisters. The medieval world nurtured scholars, apprentices, and teachers in a variety of settings. Cathedral schools taught young men not only theology but also grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the foundational arts of the medieval curriculum known as the trivium. From these schools grew the first universities, which blossomed in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Here, scholars debated ideas, translated texts, and began to shape the intellectual foundations of Europe's future. At the same time, knowledge flourished in more practical realms. Craftsmen and artisans passed down their skills through apprenticeships, learning trades by watching, doing, and listening. The blacksmith's hammer, the weaver's loom, the mason's chisel, all carried the imprint of centuries of accumulated expertise. This hands-on knowledge was crucial to the functioning of medieval society, forming the backbone of everyday life. Books themselves, though rare and precious, were not entirely inaccessible. Wealthy nobles and clergy might own collections, and local lords sometimes maintained small libraries. Manuscripts could be lent or shared among scholars, and oral recitations often supplemented written texts. The spoken word was a vital vehicle for learning, especially in a largely oral culture. Despite the limited reach of literacy, the medieval world found ways to spread knowledge widely. Sermons, plays, and public readings brought stories and teachings to life for communities gathered in churches, marketplaces, or village squares. Storytelling was a powerful tool, not only for education but for preserving history, morals, and identity. In this context, the medieval approach to knowledge challenges modern assumptions. It was less about speed and accumulation and more about depth, meaning, and connection. Learning was a tapestry woven from many threads: faith and reason, oral tradition and manuscript, practical skill and scholarly debate. Each had its place, each contributed to a shared understanding of the world. The process of learning in medieval times was deeply rooted in relationships. A young apprentice did not simply memorize techniques. They absorbed the craft through long hours beside a master, watching, imitating, and gradually gaining the confidence to experiment on their own. This form of education was personal and tactile, a passing down of both skill and values, patience, perseverance, attention to detail, that shaped not only the hands but the character. Similarly, the classroom was a social space. Scholars gathered around teachers in small groups, debating ideas aloud, questioning texts, and engaging in lively discourse. Learning was not a solitary pursuit but a communal endeavor, a shared search for understanding. The medieval student was encouraged to think critically within the bounds of faith and tradition, navigating a complex world of ideas. Books, when available, were often written in Latin, the language of the church and scholarship, which made them accessible mainly to the educated elite. But this did not stop knowledge from reaching beyond these circles. Vernacular literature began to flourish in the later Middle Ages, bringing stories, wisdom, and moral lessons to a broader audience. Works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or the Arthurian legends were not only entertainment but vehicles for cultural education, reflecting the values and struggles of the time. Libraries, though small by modern standards, were hubs of intellectual activity. Monastic scriptoria, rooms dedicated to copying texts, were places of meticulous labor, where scribes worked by candlelight, preserving the writings of ancient philosophers, church fathers, and poets. These efforts ensured that classical knowledge was not lost, but instead integrated into medieval thought, influencing theology, philosophy, and even early science. The transmission of knowledge was also marked by an awareness of the fragility of memory and record. Manuscripts could be damaged by fire, flood, or wear. Oral traditions could fade with the passing of elders. This made the work of preservation a sacred task, undertaken with humility and care. It also fostered a sense of continuity, a belief that each generation was a link in an unbroken chain stretching back to the foundations of civilization. Education in the medieval era was not merely about facts, it was about understanding the order of creation itself. Scholars sought to reconcile faith with reason, to uncover divine truths hidden in scripture and nature. The curriculum reflected this quest. The liberal arts prepared students to think logically and express ideas clearly. Theology illuminated the spiritual dimension, and natural philosophy explored the workings of the physical world. While literacy rates were low by today's standards, the medieval period planted the seeds for a growing culture of learning. Universities became centers for the exchange of ideas, attracting students from across Europe. These institutions fostered debate and inquiry, laying the groundwork for the intellectual transformations that would follow in the Renaissance and beyond. In everyday life, knowledge was practical and adaptive. Farmers learned the best times to plant by watching the stars and observing weather patterns. Healers combined herbal lore with spiritual practices. Tradespeople refined their crafts with each passing year, innovating within tradition. This knowledge was dynamic, rooted in experience but open to change when new insights emerged. The pursuit of knowledge in the medieval world was often inseparable from the spiritual. Learning was seen as a path to understanding God's creation, and education was a form of devotion. monks and scholars believed that uncovering truth in scripture or nature brought them closer to the divine. This connection infused their work with a sense of purpose beyond mere curiosity or practicality. Religious institutions played a pivotal role not only in preserving knowledge but in shaping how it was taught and understood. The Church's influence ensured that education reinforced moral and ethical frameworks, embedding lessons within a spiritual context. This framework gave meaning to abstract concepts, connecting the intellectual to the everyday life of faith, community, and duty. Yet medieval education was not static or uniform. It varied widely depending on location, social class, and the needs of the community. While monasteries and universities catered to clerics and elites, villages and towns developed their own informal systems. Guilds trained artisans, parents and neighbors taught basic skills, and oral traditions kept history and culture alive among those who never saw a written book. The power of storytelling was central to this informal education. Through fables, legends, and sermons, people absorbed lessons about justice, courage, humility, and the natural order. These stories were tailored to be memorable and meaningful, ensuring that values were passed from generation to generation. The medieval world understood that knowledge was more than data, it was wisdom woven into narrative. Furthermore, the gradual emergence of written vernacular languages expanded access to learning. As texts began to be produced in local tongues, literacy slowly spread beyond the clergy and nobility. This shift democratized knowledge, allowing a wider range of voices and experiences to be recorded and shared. The rise of vernacular literature also reflected a growing sense of cultural identity tied to place and people. Despite these advances, the medieval world faced challenges in education. Resources were limited, and many remained excluded from formal learning. Yet the value placed on knowledge and the methods of transmission ensured that information, skills, and traditions endured. The system may seem slow or incomplete to modern eyes, but it was remarkably resilient and adaptive. In reflecting on medieval education, we see a world that valued depth over speed, community over individualism, meaning over mere facts. It reminds us that learning is not just about accumulation but about connection, connecting with the past, with others, and with the world in ways that shape who we are. To truly understand medieval education and knowledge, one must begin by stepping into the quiet cloisters of a monastery, where the flickering candlelight illuminates pages meticulously copied by scribes. These men, often monks who had dedicated their lives to prayer and study, served as the guardians of knowledge in an era where books were rare and precious. Each manuscript was a laborious work of devotion, painstakingly recreated by hand, letter by letter, ink stroke by ink stroke. The colors, painstakingly mixed from minerals and plants, breathed life into the margins, delicate illustrations of saints, animals, and symbols that connected the spiritual to the everyday. In these scriptoria, knowledge was preserved with reverence. Ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, long forgotten in much of Western Europe after the fall of Rome, were painstakingly recopied alongside Christian scriptures and theological treatises. This effort was not simply about safeguarding texts, it was about transmitting a worldview, a framework through which medieval people could interpret existence itself. The intellectual efforts of these monks formed a bridge between the classical past and the future, anchoring European thought through centuries of upheaval. But the monastery was only one facet of a much broader educational landscape. As the medieval world evolved, towns and cities began to pulse with their own intellectual life. Cathedral schools emerged, often attached to the great churches that dominated city skylines. Here, young men, mostly from families preparing for clerical careers, were taught the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, collectively called the trivium. These subjects formed the foundation for higher study, training minds to analyze, communicate, and reason. Beyond the trivium, the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, offered a glimpse into the order of the cosmos. It was a curriculum designed not just for intellectual rigor but for understanding divine harmony in the natural world. The stars in the sky were not merely celestial bodies, they were part of a grand design, their movements holding meaning for the faithful below. As these schools matured, they gave rise to the first universities, institutions that would shape Western education for centuries to come. The University of Bologna, the University of Paris, and later Oxford became centers where scholars from across Europe gathered, engaging in fierce debates and pushing intellectual boundaries. These places nurtured thinkers who would wrestle with complex questions about law, medicine, philosophy, and theology, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Yet, education in the Middle Ages was not confined to grand institutions or monastic halls. The practical world thrived alongside these centers of learning. Artisans and tradespeople sustained medieval society through skilled labor passed down through generations. The apprenticeship system was a living classroom, an embodied form of knowledge transfer where seeing and doing were inseparable. A young apprentice blacksmith learned the rhythm of hammer and anvil, the heat of the forge, the tempering of steel not through books but through sweat and experience. This knowledge was as vital to medieval life as scholarly texts. In villages, knowledge was oral and communal. Stories, songs, and proverbs were vehicles for education, often woven with moral and practical lessons. A farmer might pass down wisdom about planting cycles, weather patterns, or animal behavior, ensuring survival through the unpredictable rhythms of nature. This folk knowledge was as rich and nuanced as any academic treatise, tailored to the realities of everyday life. Interestingly, literacy itself was layered and complex. Latin was the language of the learned, but vernacular languages gradually gained prominence. This shift was crucial. While Latin texts remained central to church and university education, vernacular writings, poetry, chronicles, and eventually prose, opened doors to a wider population. The works of Dante, Chaucer, and others brought stories to life in the tongues people actually spoke, spreading ideas and values beyond clerical and noble circles. This gradual democratization of knowledge had profound cultural implications. It allowed local traditions to be recorded and celebrated, giving voice to diverse experiences and identities. Education began to reflect the mosaic of medieval society rather than a single, elite perspective. Communities could see themselves mirrored in stories and teachings, reinforcing a shared sense of belonging. Yet medieval education was not without its challenges and contradictions. Resources were scarce, books were expensive and fragile. Many remained excluded from formal learning due to social class, gender, or geography. Women, for instance, were largely denied access to universities and scholarly life, though some convents became centers of female learning and manuscript production. Nonetheless, the thirst for knowledge endured, sparking innovation in teaching methods, book production, and dissemination. One such innovation was the rise of the mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans, who brought education and preaching to towns and cities, bridging the gap between the learned and the laypeople. They established schools, engaged in theological debates, and made religious knowledge more accessible. Their presence helped create a culture where learning was not confined to elites but was part of everyday spiritual life. In addition, the art of debate and dialectic flourished. The medieval student was trained to argue, question, and defend ideas, skills that underpinned legal practices, theological disputes, and academic progress. This culture of dialogue fostered critical thinking within the bounds of faith and tradition, cultivating minds that could hold complexity and nuance. Medieval education was thus a tapestry of contrasts, between oral and written, sacred and practical, elite and common, tradition and innovation. It was not a monolith but a dynamic system that evolved across centuries, shaped by the needs, values, and challenges of its time. Above all, it was an education rooted in a worldview that saw knowledge as a gift to be stewarded, a communal endeavor linking past, present, and future. The medieval learner was not simply accumulating facts but entering into a dialogue with history, faith, and the natural world. In this light, the Middle Ages reveal themselves not as a dark age of ignorance but as a complex period of intellectual richness and resilience. The legacy of this era, the manuscripts copied, the schools founded, the crafts honed, the stories told, continues to shape our understanding of learning and knowledge today. As we look closer at the everyday realities of medieval learning, it becomes clear that education was deeply practical and adaptive. The medieval mindset did not separate knowledge from life, rather, it saw learning as intimately connected to the rhythms and demands of the world around them. For example, consider the farmer who watched the skies for signs of rain or drought, who remembered which fields yielded best after certain rotations, who knew which plants thrived when planted alongside others. This agricultural knowledge was not written in books but lived through observation and memory. It was shared in village gatherings, passed from elder to child in simple yet profound lessons about survival. Healing, too, was an area where knowledge combined empirical observation with spiritual faith. The medieval healer often worked at the crossroads of medicine and magic, drawing on a mix of herbal remedies, ritual prayers, and the teachings of classical medical texts preserved in monasteries. While we might view some of these practices as superstition today, they were rooted in a deep desire to understand and combat the mysteries of illness in a world with limited technology. The reliance on nature as a teacher extended beyond the physical to the moral and philosophical. Many medieval thinkers used the natural world as a mirror for human virtues and vices. The cycle of the seasons, the behavior of animals, the growth of plants, all offered analogies for patience, growth, decay, and renewal. These natural metaphors were woven into sermons, poetry, and education, providing accessible ways for people to grapple with life's complexities. At the same time, the medieval world faced constant challenges that tested its systems of knowledge and learning. Wars disrupted communities, famine strained resources, and disease threatened life. Yet, even in these moments of crisis, the structures of education, whether formal or informal, offered tools for resilience. Clerics documented events, artisans continued their crafts, and communities drew on accumulated wisdom to endure. The medieval commitment to learning also sparked remarkable innovations in the later Middle Ages. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century revolutionized knowledge dissemination. Suddenly, books could be produced faster and more cheaply, breaking the monopoly of monasteries and elites on written texts. This technological leap laid the groundwork for the explosion of literacy and scholarship that would follow in the Renaissance. Before this revolution, however, medieval society had already established a rich culture of learning that balanced preservation with creativity, tradition with change. Knowledge was a living entity, carried in the minds of teachers and learners, etched into manuscripts, expressed in art and song, embedded in everyday life. This holistic approach offers a valuable lesson today. In our fast-paced world, where information is abundant and often fleeting, the medieval model reminds us of the value of slow, deliberate learning, of education as a shared human journey that connects us to the past and shapes our future. There is a temptation, when looking back at the medieval era, to see it through a gentle, nostalgic haze, fields bathed in golden sunlight, communities gathered in simple harmony, a life attuned to nature's rhythms. But this picture, while partly true, tells only one side of the story. The Middle Ages were also a time of harsh realities, of uncertainty, struggle, and suffering. To understand medieval life fully, we must confront these darker truths, not to diminish the era but to appreciate the resilience and complexity of the people who lived through it. Medieval life was precarious. Disease lurked around every corner, often striking without warning and sweeping through towns and villages with devastating speed. The most infamous was the Black Death, which in the 14th century wiped out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. But plague was only one among many illnesses. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, and tuberculosis were common afflictions, and medical knowledge was limited and often misguided. Hospitals, as we understand them today, were rare and rudimentary. Care was mostly home-based, reliant on family members and local healers who used a mix of herbal remedies, prayers, and sometimes harsh treatments like bloodletting. The idea of germs was unknown, so infections spread easily. Mortality rates were high, especially for children, and life expectancy was low by modern standards. Food security was another constant challenge. Most people were peasants working the land, living on subsistence farming that barely sustained them. Crop failures, whether caused by bad weather, pests, or war, could lead to famine and hunger. When harvests failed, the fragile balance of medieval communities tipped toward desperation. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them more vulnerable to disease, and social unrest often followed. War was a persistent backdrop to medieval life. Kingdoms, duchies, and fiefdoms clashed over land, power, and succession. Peasants could find themselves conscripted into armies or caught in the crossfire of sieges and raids. Castles and walled towns were built as defenses but were also symbols of a society marked by conflict and inequality. The social order itself was rigid and hierarchical. Most people were bound by laws and customs that kept them tied to the land and their lord's authority. Freedom was limited, mobility was rare. For many, daily life meant hard labor, limited rights, and little hope for advancement. Justice was often harsh and arbitrary, with punishments that could be brutal by today's standards. Technology, too, was limited. While there were impressive feats of engineering and craftsmanship, the absence of advanced machinery meant that most work was manual and time-consuming. Roads were often poor, making travel difficult and slow. Communication relied on messengers, and information spread at a fraction of the speed we take for granted. Yet, within these hardships, medieval people developed remarkable strategies for coping and thriving. Community bonds provided social safety nets, neighbors helped neighbors, families pooled resources, and local traditions offered guidance and comfort. Faith offered meaning and hope, framing suffering within a larger cosmic story. Acknowledging the drawbacks of medieval life does not diminish its significance, rather, it highlights the strength and adaptability of its people. Understanding their challenges helps us appreciate how they built the foundations of modern society, surviving and shaping a world that was often unforgiving. To grasp the true nature of medieval hardship, one must first understand how intimately life was tied to the land and how fragile that connection could be. The vast majority of people in the Middle Ages were peasants, bound to fields that provided the bare essentials for survival. Their world was small, limited to the village, the manor, and the surrounding countryside. Yet, despite this seeming simplicity, their daily existence was a constant negotiation with forces far beyond their control. The rhythm of the seasons dictated everything, from when to plant and harvest, to when to repair homes and prepare for winter's harsh embrace. The land was both giver and taker, its bounty uncertain and its demands relentless. A bad year meant more than an empty granary, it threatened famine, disease, and social unrest. Famine was a specter that haunted medieval Europe with terrifying regularity. When crops failed due to drought, flooding, or blight, food became scarce, and hunger spread rapidly. Chronic malnutrition weakened bodies and minds, making people more susceptible to illness. Records from the 14th century detail repeated famines that devastated regions, sometimes in tandem with outbreaks of plague. The scarcity of food also had social consequences. As desperation grew, people competed fiercely for resources. Prices soared, theft became common, and tensions erupted into violence. In some cases, entire communities were displaced, forced to migrate in search of sustenance. The medieval social fabric was stretched thin by these pressures. Disease was another invisible enemy that shaped every aspect of life. Medieval medicine, though earnest in its efforts, was hampered by a limited understanding of causes and treatments. Theories of imbalance in bodily humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, guided medical practice, often leading to harsh treatments like bloodletting or purging that did more harm than good. The Black Death stands as the most dramatic example of the impact of medieval diseases. Arriving in Europe in the mid-14th century, it swept through towns and countryside with horrifying speed, killing millions. Entire villages vanished, family lines were broken, and economies were shattered. The psychological impact was profound. Fear and despair permeated societies, challenging faith and social order alike. But plague was just one of many afflictions. Leprosy, for example, carried both physical suffering and social stigma. Those afflicted were often forced into isolated colonies, cut off from communities, embodying the harsh intersection of health and social exclusion. Meanwhile, illnesses like smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis silently claimed countless lives, often without detailed records. Warfare added yet another layer of hardship. The medieval period was marked by almost constant conflict, local skirmishes, dynastic wars, crusades, and invasions. Castles dotted the landscape not only as noble residences but as fortresses of defense against raids and sieges. For peasants, war meant destruction of crops, forced conscription, displacement, and the ever-present threat of violence. Battles themselves were brutal affairs, with crude weapons and armor, and few protections for common soldiers. The toll on armies and civilians alike was heavy. Raids could leave villages in ashes, while sieges brought starvation and disease to fortified towns. The instability bred by warfare permeated everyday life, undermining any sense of security. Social hierarchy reinforced these difficulties. Medieval society was deeply stratified. Kings and nobles wielded power, while peasants and serfs labored under strict obligations. Serfs were legally bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission. Their lives were regulated by feudal contracts that demanded taxes, labor, and loyalty in exchange for protection. Freedom was a rare and precious commodity. For many, the prospect of improving their station was slim. Mobility, both social and geographic, was limited. Justice was often harsh, with punishments ranging from fines to public humiliation, corporal punishment, or execution. Courts were controlled by local lords or ecclesiastical authorities, and fairness depended largely on one's status and connections. Daily labor was exhausting and unrelenting. From dawn till dusk, peasants toiled in fields, tended animals, maintained homes, and fulfilled their lord's demands. The tools they used were simple: wooden plows, sickles, hoes, and progress was slow. Weather conditions could make work nearly impossible, and accidents or illness could mean ruin. Homes themselves were basic and often crowded. A typical peasant's house might be a single room with a dirt floor, a thatched roof, and little protection from cold or damp. Fire was a constant hazard, and hygiene was rudimentary. Sanitation was minimal, contributing to the spread of disease. Despite these severe conditions, medieval communities found ways to survive and even thrive. Strong social bonds formed the foundation of resilience. Neighbors shared food, labor, and knowledge. Festivals and religious observances provided moments of joy and communal identity, offering relief from hardship. Faith was a cornerstone in the medieval worldview. The church was both a spiritual refuge and a social institution, offering care to the sick, charity to the poor, and a framework for understanding suffering. Religious rituals, prayers, and pilgrimages connected people to a larger cosmos, giving meaning to their struggles. This blend of harshness and hope shaped the character of medieval society. It forged individuals and communities capable of endurance, creativity, and adaptation. While life was often brutal by modern standards, it was also rich in relationships, traditions, and a sense of purpose that carried people through dark times. As the seasons cycled relentlessly, medieval people faced another hidden but constant threat: the unpredictability of the weather. Unlike today, there were no advanced forecasts or meteorological understanding. The sky was read like an ancient script. Cloud formations, winds, and bird behavior offered clues, but these signs could be misleading. A sudden frost, an unseasonal storm, or a long drought could wipe out entire harvests. This volatility made planning for the future a precarious endeavor. In the colder northern regions, the infamous Little Ice Age began in the later Middle Ages, bringing harsher winters and shorter growing seasons. Crops that once flourished began to fail, forcing communities to adapt or face starvation. The impact rippled beyond the fields. Malnutrition led to weakened immune systems, making disease outbreaks even more deadly. The diet of most medieval peasants was monotonous and sparse. Bread, pottage, a kind of stew, and seasonal vegetables formed the staple meals. Meat was a rarity for most, reserved for special occasions or for those with wealth. Hunting rights were tightly controlled by nobility, so peasants had limited access to game. Fishing, when available, supplemented diets but depended on location and season. Malnutrition didn't just cause physical weakness, it stunted mental and social development. Children born into famine conditions faced lifelong consequences. Yet even with these challenges, medieval communities maintained a profound connection to their environment, crafting a deep knowledge of plants, animals, and ecological cycles. This practical wisdom was crucial for survival. Disease, the silent spectre, thrived in conditions of poverty, overcrowding, and poor sanitation. Towns were often cramped and filthy. Waste was dumped into streets or nearby rivers, which also supplied drinking water. This created perfect breeding grounds for pathogens. The spread of diseases like typhus and cholera was rapid and merciless. The Black Death's arrival was cataclysmic. Originating from Central Asia and carried along trade routes, it struck Europe in waves. Symptoms were terrifying: swollen lymph nodes, fevers, vomiting, and blackened skin patches. Entire families vanished within days. The sheer scale of death challenged religious and social norms, shaking faith and order. In the aftermath, surviving communities faced labor shortages that shifted power dynamics. Peasants, once bound tightly to their lords, found they could demand better conditions or wages. This subtle upheaval planted seeds for future social changes but came at an immense human cost. Beyond disease and famine, medieval warfare cast a long shadow. Feudal lords raised armies of knights and foot soldiers, often drawn from the peasant class. For many, war was not a distant event but a brutal interruption of daily life. Sieges devastated fields and homes, while pillaging armies stripped villages of food and valuables. The psychological toll was immense. Constant threat bred fear and instability. Children grew up hearing tales of violence, learning to navigate a world where safety was fragile. The warrior elite celebrated valor and honor, but for common folk, war meant loss and suffering. Justice in medieval society was a complex and often brutal affair. Legal systems varied by region, but common themes persisted. Punishments were public and designed to deter wrongdoing. Stocks, whipping, mutilation, and execution were not uncommon. Trial by ordeal, where the accused might be subjected to fire or water tests, reflected a belief that divine intervention would reveal truth, but such methods were dangerous and arbitrary. Women faced particular challenges. Although some noble women managed estates and wielded influence, most had limited rights and were subject to patriarchal control. Domestic violence, forced marriages, and lack of legal protections underscored their vulnerability. However, women also played crucial roles in family and community life, often managing households, farms, and informal economies. Despite the starkness of medieval hardships, people found ways to create meaning and joy. Festivals marked the calendar, bringing music, dance, feasting, and religious observance. These moments of celebration reinforced community bonds and provided respite from toil. Art and literature flourished even amid adversity. Illuminated manuscripts, cathedral carvings, and folk tales expressed a rich cultural tapestry. These creative acts were not escapes but integral parts of how medieval people understood themselves and their world. Medieval life, with all its difficulties, was a testament to human endurance. It challenges modern assumptions about progress and civilization by revealing a society that was both fragile and resilient, brutal and compassionate, harsh and deeply meaningful. To fully understand the weight of medieval life's challenges, it's essential to explore the layers of daily hardship endured by the peasantry, who made up the vast majority of the population. Their lives were framed by relentless labor, where every day was a test of endurance against exhaustion, hunger, and hardship. The fields were not just places of work but arenas of survival. From the moment dawn broke, the peasant's day was dictated by the seasons and the demands of the land. Spring was a frantic period of planting and preparing soil, when every hand was needed to turn the earth and sow seeds. Summer brought the hope of growth but also the need for vigilance against pests and weather. Harvest time, the most crucial and labor-intensive season, could determine a family's fate for the coming year. A failed harvest spelled hunger, a bountiful one meant survival. Winter, far from a season of rest, was a time of scarcity and hardship. With the land dormant and stored food supplies limited, families faced cold and hunger. Fires were kept low to conserve wood, clothing was patched and layered, and illnesses, already rampant, became even more deadly in the freezing months. The long nights were filled with storytelling, prayer, and small comforts to ward off despair. Peasants' diets were simple but far from nutritious. The staple was coarse bread made from rye or barley, often supplemented by pottage, a watery stew of vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat or fish. Wild fruits, nuts, and herbs were gathered from the woods when available. Meat was a luxury, often restricted by hunting laws that favored the nobility. This meager diet led to widespread nutritional deficiencies, including scurvy and rickets. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Waste disposal consisted mostly of throwing refuse into streets or rivers, creating filthy conditions that encouraged the spread of disease. In towns, cramped living quarters were breeding grounds for lice and fleas, vectors of plague and typhus. Bathing was infrequent and sometimes discouraged for fear of weakening the body's natural defenses. The structure of medieval society reinforced these hardships. The feudal system was a web of obligations and duties that tied peasants to their lord's land and authority. Serfs were legally bound to the manor, obliged to provide labor, pay rents, and obey local justice. Freedom was scarce, and the threat of punishment was ever present. This system created stability for the ruling classes but limited the mobility and autonomy of the majority. Justice itself was brutal and swift. Minor crimes might be punished by fines or public humiliation, while serious offenses could result in corporal punishment or death. Trial by combat or ordeal was not uncommon, placing the outcome in the hands of fate or divine will rather than evidence. Prisons were grim places, often little more than holding cells before punishment. Warfare added another dimension of instability. The constant skirmishes and territorial disputes of the era meant that villages could be attacked, crops burned, and livestock stolen. Peasants often found themselves caught between warring factions, their lives disrupted by conscription, displacement, or pillaging armies. The presence of knights and soldiers brought both protection and peril. Women, while often overlooked in historical narratives, played vital roles within this difficult world. Beyond their domestic duties, many managed farms and estates, especially during their husbands' absences at war. Yet their legal rights were severely limited, and they faced societal expectations that constrained their independence. Marriage was often a matter of family alliances and economic necessity rather than choice. Despite all these trials, medieval communities developed remarkable resilience. Mutual aid and cooperation were essential. Harvest festivals, religious holidays, and communal workdays reinforced bonds and offered moments of relief and joy. These traditions provided psychological and social anchors in a world where uncertainty loomed large. Religion permeated every aspect of life, offering comfort and meaning. The church was not only a spiritual institution but a social one, providing charity to the poor and sick, education to some, and a moral framework that explained suffering and injustice. Monks and nuns cared for the sick in rudimentary hospitals, and parish priests were often central figures in village life. Artistic expression flourished as well, serving as both worship and storytelling. Illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, and stained glass windows narrated biblical stories and local legends, providing a shared cultural identity. Music and poetry, often performed during festivals or religious ceremonies, enriched communal life. Ultimately, the Middle Ages were neither a dark void nor a golden age, but a complex mosaic of hardship, endurance, faith, and culture. The people who lived through this time were shaped by challenges that tested their bodies, minds, and spirits. Their responses to these challenges laid the foundations for the social, cultural, and technological transformations that would follow. Beyond the immediate challenges of daily survival, the medieval world was shaped by an overarching awareness of mortality. Death was an omnipresent companion, not just a distant eventuality but a force that could arrive suddenly and sweep away entire families or communities. The proximity of death shaped how medieval people lived, thought, and understood their place in the world. Graveyards were often crowded and close to villages, a constant reminder of the thin line between life and death. Funerals were significant communal events, filled with ritual and meaning, emphasizing the hope for an afterlife even as the present was marked by suffering. The Church's teachings offered comfort by promising salvation for the faithful, but they also imposed strict codes on behavior, aimed at guiding souls through a precarious existence. This ever-present mortality influenced everything from art to literature. Memento mori, reminders of death, were common motifs, encouraging people to live piously and prepare for the afterlife. Skeletons and skulls appeared in religious paintings and tomb sculptures, symbolizing both the fragility and the fleeting nature of earthly life. The psychological impact of such a worldview was profound. People faced their hardships not only with physical endurance but with spiritual resolve. Suffering was often seen as a test of faith or a form of purification. This mindset helped individuals and communities bear the weight of their daily struggles, providing a sense of purpose and hope amid adversity. Yet, despite the omnipresence of death and hardship, medieval society was not static or resigned. Change was a slow but constant undercurrent. Technological innovations, such as the heavy plough and three-field crop rotation, gradually improved agricultural productivity. This, in turn, allowed populations to grow and towns to develop. Trade expanded, connecting distant regions and introducing new goods, ideas, and cultural influences. Markets and fairs became centers of social and economic life, offering peasants and merchants opportunities to engage beyond their local communities. The rise of guilds helped regulate crafts and trades, ensuring standards and supporting workers. Education, though limited mostly to clergy and nobility, began to spread with the establishment of universities in the later medieval period. These centers of learning preserved classical knowledge and fostered intellectual inquiry, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance and beyond. Politically, the Middle Ages saw the gradual centralization of power. Monarchies strengthened, legal systems evolved, and the concept of citizenship slowly took root. While the feudal order remained dominant for centuries, cracks appeared that would eventually lead to more modern forms of governance. These transformations did not erase the hardships but changed their context and scale. The medieval world was dynamic, shaped by tensions between tradition and innovation, stability and upheaval, suffering and hope. Looking back, it becomes clear that medieval life cannot be reduced to simple stereotypes of darkness or idyllic simplicity. It was a world of contradictions, where brutal realities coexisted with profound spirituality, harsh labor with moments of joy, and fragility with resilience. This complexity is what makes the study of the Middle Ages endlessly fascinating. It challenges modern assumptions and invites us to reflect on the human capacity to endure, adapt, and find meaning, even in the toughest of circumstances. As the medieval era gradually gave way to the early modern period, the echoes of its long centuries of life, struggle, and culture continued to shape the world in profound ways. The legacy of medieval life is woven into the very fabric of our modern society, often hidden beneath the layers of progress and innovation, but no less influential. It is a legacy that challenges the simplistic idea of the Middle Ages as merely a dark interlude between classical antiquity and the Renaissance, revealing instead a vibrant, complex era whose influence endures. One of the most enduring aspects of medieval life was its shaping of social structures that resonate even today. The notion of community, rooted in shared work, mutual dependence, and collective identity, was central to medieval existence. Villages and towns were not just places of residence, they were interconnected networks where cooperation was necessary for survival. This strong sense of local belonging laid the groundwork for later ideas of citizenship and civic responsibility, foundational to modern society. Feudalism, though often criticized as a rigid and oppressive system, established the framework for organized governance, law, and hierarchy. It created a set of reciprocal obligations that, despite their inequalities, provided a measure of stability in a turbulent world. The relationships between lord and vassal, lord and serf, were complex bonds of duty, protection, and social order. Traces of these ideas can be found in contemporary legal and property systems, where duties and rights still intertwine. The medieval church, a dominant institution of its time, also left a profound imprint. Beyond its spiritual mission, it became a center of education, art, charity, and political influence. Medieval cathedrals and monasteries are architectural marvels that continue to inspire awe and reverence. The Church's role in preserving knowledge through manuscripts and fostering learning in universities laid essential foundations for the intellectual awakening of later centuries. Culturally, the Middle Ages contributed a wealth of art, literature, and traditions that continue to captivate us. From the illuminated manuscripts filled with intricate designs to epic poems and folk tales that survive in various forms, the medieval imagination was rich and varied. Festivals, music, and religious rituals shaped communal life and continue to influence cultural celebrations today. But perhaps the most profound legacy lies in the very human stories of resilience and adaptation. Medieval people faced extraordinary challenges: war, famine, disease, social constraints, and yet they built lives filled with meaning, creativity, and connection. Their experience teaches us about the endurance of the human spirit in the face of adversity, reminding us that progress is not just about technological advances but about the deep bonds that hold societies together. As we reflect on medieval life, we also recognize the continuity of certain struggles, the tension between power and justice, the balance between community and individuality, and the search for purpose amid uncertainty. These are not problems confined to the past but ongoing themes in the human story. The medieval era invites us to look beyond the surface of history, to appreciate complexity, and to honor the lives of those who came before us. Their world was different yet familiar, distant yet foundational. By understanding their challenges and triumphs, we gain insight into our society and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the paths that brought us here. The medieval period's influence extends far beyond castles and cathedrals. It is embedded in the very way societies organize themselves, the cultural expressions we cherish, and even in the rhythms of daily life that persist in subtle ways. Understanding this legacy requires stepping back and appreciating the medieval world not as a distant, disconnected past, but as a foundation stone upon which much of the modern world was built. One cannot discuss the legacy of the Middle Ages without acknowledging how it shaped the development of cities and urban life. Though often overshadowed by the romanticized image of rural villages and sprawling feudal estates, medieval towns and cities were dynamic centers of commerce, innovation, and social life. The growth of these urban hubs facilitated the rise of a merchant class that gradually challenged the dominance of the nobility, laying the groundwork for the social and economic shifts that would ripple through Europe for centuries. Markets and fairs were more than economic venues, they were social spaces where ideas, fashions, and customs mixed and evolved. This mixing helped break down some of the rigid class barriers that characterized medieval society, introducing new social mobility and diversifying cultural life. The guilds that emerged in these cities played a crucial role in shaping labor relations, protecting the interests of craftsmen and workers, and developing standards that would influence modern professional organizations. Another vital legacy lies in medieval law and governance. The complex web of feudal obligations evolved into more centralized legal systems over time. Concepts such as property rights, contracts, and common law have their roots in medieval practices. The Magna Carta of 1215, often hailed as a cornerstone of modern democracy, was born out of the medieval struggle between king and barons, highlighting early demands for legal limits on power and protection of individual rights. Religious life, too, left a deep imprint. The medieval church was an institution that extended its reach into every facet of life, from birth and marriage to death and beyond. It was a source of spiritual comfort but also a formidable political force. The patronage of the arts, establishment of universities, and the codification of moral and ethical norms contributed to shaping Western civilization. Medieval theology and philosophy, with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, laid intellectual foundations that continue to influence modern thought. Art and architecture from the medieval period remain among the world's most celebrated achievements. The soaring Gothic cathedrals, with their stained glass windows and intricate sculptures, are monuments to faith, community, and human ingenuity. These structures were more than places of worship, they were centers of social life, learning, and artistic endeavor. Manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf and vivid colors preserved stories and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The literature and folklore of the Middle Ages continue to resonate. Epic tales of knights, quests, and moral lessons, like those in the Arthurian legends or the poetry of Chaucer, have shaped Western storytelling traditions. Folk songs and proverbs passed down through generations connect us with the everyday medieval person, revealing values, humor, and wisdom that transcend time. Socially, the medieval emphasis on community and mutual support offers lessons for today's increasingly fragmented societies. The idea that people are interconnected and responsible for each other was not just idealistic but necessary for survival. Shared labor, communal celebrations, and collective care for the vulnerable formed the bedrock of medieval life. In many ways, these practices foreshadowed modern concepts of social welfare and cooperation. Moreover, the medieval period's grappling with hardship and resilience speaks to universal human experiences. Facing disease, war, and deprivation, medieval people developed coping strategies grounded in faith, art, and community solidarity. This resilience helped societies endure through turbulent times and emerge transformed. It reminds us that progress is not linear but often involves cycles of struggle, adaptation, and renewal. Technological and intellectual developments, often underestimated in popular imagination, were crucial medieval contributions. Innovations like the mechanical clock, improved plows, windmills, and watermills revolutionized agriculture and industry. The rise of universities preserved and expanded knowledge in medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and law. These advances created the conditions for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed. Finally, the legacy of the Middle Ages is visible in modern identity and culture. Many European nations trace their origins, traditions, and symbols to this period. The medieval period's language, customs, and institutions evolved into those that define contemporary societies. Even modern holidays, legal systems, and educational structures carry traces of medieval roots. By delving into this complex legacy, we not only honor the past but also enrich our understanding of the present. The medieval era was a crucible of human experience where hardship and creativity, faith and doubt, power and justice intertwined to shape the course of history. Recognizing this deep connection invites us to view history not as distant chapters but as an ongoing conversation, one in which the voices and lessons of medieval life continue to speak. As we look back, it becomes clear that the medieval era was not merely a backdrop for grand events or famous figures, but a living, breathing world shaped by countless individuals whose daily lives forged the path to modernity. The lessons of medieval life are embedded in the structures of society, culture, and thought that surround us, often in ways we scarcely realize. The medieval mindset itself, rooted in a worldview that embraced complexity, paradox, and mystery, offers an alternative lens through which to view our contemporary challenges. Medieval people understood life as a tapestry woven from light and darkness, joy and suffering, certainty and doubt. This acceptance of ambiguity can be a powerful reminder in today's fast-paced, often polarized world. At the heart of the medieval legacy is the idea that community matters profoundly. The interconnectedness of families, villages, guilds, and churches provided not only survival but identity and purpose. In an era when individualism was far less pronounced, people found meaning in belonging and contributing to something larger than themselves. This emphasis on social bonds encourages us to reconsider the value of community and collective responsibility in modern times. Furthermore, the medieval period's relationship with nature holds valuable insights. Living so closely with the land, medieval people developed a respect for natural cycles and a deep knowledge of their environment. In an age grappling with ecological crises, revisiting these perspectives can inspire a more harmonious approach to our relationship with the natural world. The resilience displayed by medieval communities in the face of adversity is another enduring legacy. Despite plagues, famines, wars, and social upheaval, these people adapted, innovated, and persevered. Their stories are a testament to the strength of the human spirit. A reminder that even the most challenging circumstances can be met with courage and creativity. Medieval art, literature, and architecture continue to inspire because they capture universal themes of hope, faith, and the search for meaning. Their beauty and complexity invite us to slow down, reflect, and connect across time. They remind us that creativity thrives even amid hardship, and that cultural expression is a vital thread in the fabric of human existence. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval legacy invites humility. It cautions against simplistic judgments about progress or civilization, encouraging us instead to appreciate the nuances of history. The Middle Ages were neither wholly dark nor wholly bright, but a rich, multifaceted epoch that challenges us to embrace complexity in our understanding of the past and present. As we close this exploration of medieval life, we carry with us a renewed appreciation for the generations who lived, loved, struggled, and dreamed long before our time. Their legacy is a mirror reflecting our shared humanity, urging us to learn from their endurance, celebrate their creativity, and continue the story they helped begin. The medieval era, stretching over nearly a millennium, was far more than a bridge between antiquity and modernity. It was a profound chapter in human history that shaped the cultural, social, and political contours of the world we inhabit today. As we reflect on the legacy of this period, it is clear that its influence is vast, layered, and often subtle, hidden beneath the more visible landmarks of history but no less vital. One of the most striking legacies of medieval life lies in the ways it molded our sense of community and social responsibility. In a world without the conveniences and technologies we take for granted, survival depended on the strength of interpersonal bonds. The collective effort was not optional, it was a necessity. Every villager's labor, every family's contribution, was a vital thread in the fabric that held society together. This deep-rooted interdependence fostered social norms that valued cooperation, mutual aid, and shared identity. Today, as we navigate the complexities of a globalized world, the medieval emphasis on community still resonates. Modern societies grapple with questions of belonging, social cohesion, and the balance between individual rights and collective good. The medieval example reminds us that community is more than a backdrop, it is an active, living network of relationships that shape identity and purpose. The medieval model of interconnectedness offers a powerful counterpoint to contemporary individualism and social fragmentation. Feudalism, often maligned as a rigid and oppressive system, also laid important groundwork for governance and law. Its hierarchical but reciprocal relationships between lord and vassal, master and serf, were early forms of the social contract. These relationships, with all their inequalities and obligations, contributed to evolving ideas of rights, duties, and justice. The Magna Carta, emerging from the medieval struggle for balance between monarchy and nobility, stands as a landmark in the development of constitutional law, echoing through the centuries into today's democratic frameworks. The medieval church's role in shaping Western civilization cannot be overstated. As the dominant institution for much of the era, it influenced not only spiritual life but also education, art, politics, and social welfare. Monasteries preserved and copied manuscripts, becoming the custodians of classical knowledge. Universities, many founded in the medieval period, became centers of intellectual life, producing scholars who laid the foundations of modern science, philosophy, and law. This legacy of knowledge preservation and transmission is a testament to the medieval commitment to learning, despite widespread illiteracy and limited access. The painstaking labor of scribes, the illuminated manuscripts, the debates of scholastic philosophers, all represent a bridge between the ancient world and the modern age. In this light, the medieval period appears less as a dark age and more as a crucible where ideas were tested, refined, and passed on. Artistically, the Middle Ages gifted us with a rich tapestry of cultural achievements that continue to inspire. Gothic cathedrals, with their soaring spires and intricate stained glass, embody a fusion of faith, art, and community effort. These buildings were not merely religious structures but centers of civic pride and social life, testaments to human ingenuity and devotion. Similarly, the literature and folklore of the time, from chivalric romances to ballads and legends, capture the complexities of human experience, blending history, myth, and moral inquiry. The medieval period's approach to time and nature also offers valuable perspectives. Life was organized around natural rhythms, the changing seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, the cycles of planting and harvest. This attunement to nature fostered a respect and understanding often lost in today's technological world. The medieval connection to the land shaped not only livelihoods but spirituality, where natural elements were imbued with symbolic and sacred meaning. In an era where environmental concerns are paramount, revisiting medieval attitudes towards nature can inspire a renewed sense of stewardship. Their awareness of interdependence between humans and the environment reflects a balance we continue to seek. The agricultural innovations of the Middle Ages, such as crop rotation and water management, laid early foundations for sustainable practices that still hold relevance. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of medieval life is the human capacity for resilience. Facing frequent wars, plagues, famines, and social upheaval, medieval communities adapted and endured. Their stories are not only about survival but about finding meaning amid adversity. Faith, art, community rituals, and shared stories provided psychological and emotional sustenance. The Black Death, one of the most devastating events of the period, reshaped societies in profound ways. It challenged existing social orders, labor relations, and religious beliefs, catalyzing changes that contributed to the end of feudalism and the rise of new economic and social structures. This illustrates how hardship can precipitate transformation, a theme as relevant today as it was then. The medieval legacy is also a mirror reflecting the paradoxes of human history. It was a time of both great suffering and remarkable creativity, of strict hierarchies and emerging ideas of individual dignity. Understanding this complexity helps dismantle simplistic narratives and encourages a nuanced appreciation of history's layers. Today, medieval influences persist in myriad forms, from the languages we speak and the laws we follow, to the holidays we celebrate and the stories we tell. The very architecture of many European cities bears the imprint of medieval design. The values of charity, hospitality, and community service, central to medieval religious life, continue to shape modern social ethics. By engaging with the medieval past, we also engage with ourselves. History is not a static record but a dialogue across time. The medieval era invites us to consider how past experiences shape present identities and future possibilities. It challenges us to learn from endurance, creativity, and the enduring quest for meaning. In embracing this legacy, we find inspiration to face our challenges with resilience and hope. The Middle Ages, far from being a distant and irrelevant past, remain a source of insight into the enduring human journey, one marked by complexity, struggle, and the persistent striving for a better world. As we come to the close of this exploration, I want to take a moment to reflect on what the medieval era truly teaches us. It is more than a distant time of castles and knights, it's a vivid story of people who lived with the rhythms of nature, who built communities from trust and cooperation, and who found meaning even in hardship. Their lives remind us that history isn't just about dates and events, but about human experiences that continue to echo in our own. In many ways, the medieval past invites us to slow down, to look closer at the ties that bind us, and to appreciate the resilience and creativity that have always defined humanity. It encourages us to embrace complexity, to hold space for uncertainty, and to find strength in connection with each other, with our environment, and with the stories that shape us. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval life. I hope these stories and reflections have sparked your curiosity, deepened your understanding, and maybe even inspired you to see history and the world around you with fresh eyes. History is a shared journey, and your presence here is part of that ongoing conversation. If this exploration moved you, or if you have questions, stories, or thoughts to share, I'd love to hear from you. After all, the story of humanity is never truly complete. It lives in each of us, in how we remember the past and build the future. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and may the lessons of the past guide you in your path forward.